Good evening, everyone. And thank you very much, Islam and the IOSH UAE committee for having me today. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, that's good. All right, so this is my first time attending an IOSH event. Really pleased to see the big turnout, and I am looking forward to getting further engaged. Happy to have members from IOSH UK over here. Welcome to Dubai. So, all right, they're not being able to hear me? Okay. Let me move this a bit up.
So try to speak really loud.
All right.
Otherwise, you can't.
Must be clearer now? Yeah? Okay. All right, so before I continue, let me give you a brief background about myself. You can also check out my profile on LinkedIn. So I've been working in my professional life has been around 15 years so far. I've lived in the UAE for a long time. I practically grew up here. My educational background is in environmental science. And in the past 15 years, my primary exposure has been in the EPC, engineering and construction environment, where I've worked in corporate HSE roles. So I've also had a bit of experience working as a consultant, environmental consultant actually. I've worked on the client side too for an year with the ADNOC Group in a PMC role. Presently, I work for a company called Petrofac, which you may be familiar with. They have a large footprint here in the UAE. Their regional office is in Sharjah, so I work with their corporate office as an HSE advisor. And safety differently, the topic that I'll be speaking about today is something that I've been personally researching, I'd say over the past year or so, and especially in the past few months, I've been reading up a bit more about it. So today I'll basically be presenting my interpretation of what the safety differently, or what is sometimes known as safety 2.0. What does that mean? What does it entail? I'll be speaking at a bit of a higher level, and excuse me if I move a bit fast through the slides, just keeping in view the time available, but I'll be very happy to speak to any one of you further about this, especially in the Q&A session or after our presentation. Before I continue, I'm curious to know, has anyone in the room heard of this concept, safety differently or safety 2.0? Maybe if you can just let me know by a show of hands, people who are familiar with that. Okay, so not a lot, so that's good. I hope then you go away today, learning something new, and I hope this is enlightening, my presentation. I'll try to keep it as engaging as possible. So before I jump into the background of the safety differently or safety 2.0 concept, again, I'd like to ask you all a question. In your HSE or safety career so far, what has been your experience in terms of bureaucracy? So what I mean to say is documentation and requirements, regulations around safety. Do you think that, do you think it's too much? Do you think that there's a lot of documentation and reporting requirement? Do you feel that way? I'm curious to know, just by a show of hands, if you could let me know who agrees with the statement, who thinks that in terms of regulations, in terms of documentation requirements, the safety field, let's say, is it's burdened. Do you feel burdened in your roles? Just by a show of hands. Externally or internally? Externally, you do feel that way, yeah. I personally share that too. Like I said, over the past 15 years, working with different organizations, I've found that, as time increases, and especially as companies mature too, somehow the standards, the requirements, the regulations in terms of, what you need to comply with when we talk about safety, that just seems to keep on increasing. Now, this opinion is shared by other companies, by other academics around the world, people who study this concept of safety differently and safety 2.0. So two names of academics, of researchers are especially prominent. One of them, his name is Sidney Dekker. And if you just Google him, you'll come across quite some material on safety differently, the research that he's carried out. He's based in Australia, and he's associated with Griffith University. And there's another person, another researcher by the name of Erik Holnagel. So he's associated with, he's in Denmark, and he's associated with a university over there. So both Sidney Decker and Eric Holnagel, they've been researching on this concept of safety differently, especially this has gained much more traction over the past, I'd say, 1 year or so. So what happened, the rationale behind this is that researchers, they've been looking at safety statistics across different industries and also within companies for a time period. And they found that, with time, as number of incidents decrease, there's a diminishing return. They do not touch that x-axis. Like what Islam was talking about earlier, the concept of zero incidents or zero harm. For some reason, companies or industries have not been able to achieve that. But at the same time, bureaucracy in terms of standards, regulations, they just keep on piling up. And many individuals, many professionals, many companies, many industries find that in terms of reporting requirements, they just seem to keep on increasing with time. So we seem to be stuck in a loop over here, And Einstein has famously said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and still expecting different results. So basically this means something is wrong, something needs to be changed over here, right? We need to approach this idea of regulations and standards and bureaucracy in safety. We need to approach it in a different way. So that's where the topic of safety differently, or what is sometimes known as safety 2.0, comes in. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you briefly about today, like how do we move from that traditional view and that traditional attitude towards safety in terms of regulations, inspections, checklists, documentation, all that stuff, process-based, to safety 2.0, which is more concerned with what goes right and how do we continue, how do we explore that, how do we promote that, This diagram is from one of the research papers by Professor Sidney. So basically, I'd just like to draw your attention towards this red colored part of the graph on the left-hand side, which is pointing towards unwanted or extreme unwanted outcomes. So in that case, we're talking about major accidents, major events like fatalities or explosions or the like. And it's interesting to note over here, it says that traditional safety uses a small portion of that total experience base, meaning to say that traditional safety is much more concerned about how do you prevent those major accidents, how do you prevent those multiple fatalities, for example. What about all the rest of this graph? What about all the area on the right-hand side? And that's what that question up there asks, right? What about the 99.999% of the time, so to speak, in which things go right? And do we understand why success is the rule and not the exceptions? Just to make it clear, this is a pie chart which is basically telling the same, asking the same question over here. If you were to assume that 10,000 events take place, right, or 10,000 tasks take place, or 10,000 hours are worked, right, and out of that, let's say there's one failure that occurs. What about the 9,999 non-failures? Why is there no focus on that? That is the central question over here, that the concept of safety differently or safety 2.0 is asking. Like, why do we not focus on all those events that go right? All the times when we do not have a major incident or accident occurring. Obviously, these numbers are arbitrary. They'll differ by each industry and, each country and each company that we talk to. So to put it in another way, a worker carries out work, right? So if we look at this straight line, this is what I call work as imagined, meaning to say that in an ideal world, a worker would carry out a work without any external or internal interference in a safe manner and complete it via following steps 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Let's say it's a simple algorithm. But we know that this is not what really happens in the real world. So let me illustrate this by a simple example. Let's say a person is driving from point A to point B, right? So if we were to focus only on safe driving from point A to point B, that person would be following the straight line. But we know in let's say a work environment, a construction environment, for example, or even in daily life when we drive in the city, there are various factors that come into play, right? We have other vehicles, we have pedestrians around us. Then if I talk on an internal level, it's the driver themselves, their mental health, are they, for example, listening to music? Are they doing, there are many internal, external factors that come into play which do not make the work as smooth, right? So that's why you have those peaks and troughs in terms of the way work is carried out. The point that safety differently makes, or safety 2.0, what they're trying to focus on is, how do we stay as close as possible to this line? How do we work in such a way that we reduce those instances, those peaks and troughs, those deviations from the norm? So we want to focus on that central line over there. Whatever task, whatever work we're carrying out. That is the idea over here. To put it in another way, the traditional thought around accidents and incidents occurring has been that if you follow the correct method, no event occurs. And if you follow a separate incorrect method, that would lead to an accident. Of course, in the context of having regulations and procedures present. But safety differently, or the concept of safety 2.0, does not look at it this way. What we're saying over here is that there is one method of carrying out a task, okay? And if you deviate as less as possible from that one correct method, it results in no event. But if the deviation is strong enough or far enough from the correct method, that could lead to an accident. Of course, we are still working in the context of having procedures and regulations present. So I'm trying to make it as simple as possible grammatically. Over here, I'm again for further information and introspection, I'm listing down some differences that I've found in my words between the safety 1 and the safety 2 concept. That will probably make it a bit easier for us to understand the point we're trying to make over here. So the first one over here is safety 1 is concerned with it's a pursuit of a condition where nothing goes wrong. Like I mentioned earlier, that focus on what goes wrong, on events, on accidents occurring. Whereby safety 2 is the pursuit of a condition where as many things as possible go right. So as you can see, the mindset is different, almost diametrically opposite to that. Safety 1, it's concerned more with the work of safety, that bureaucracy that I was talking about, all those checklists, regulations, all that stuff. But safety 2 is more concerned with the safety of the work, right? So the focus here is not on HSE regulations and standards and requirements, the focus is actually the work itself. In a safety 1 environment, workers do work carefully, but they are constricted by regulations. And this can lead to what we call an overconfidence bias, or workers being complacent in the knowledge that, okay, we have all these HSE regulations, standards, we have an HSE department, and they're the ones who will regulate the safety of the environment or the site that we're working in. Whereby in a safety 2 environment, workers work confident in their ability to work safely majority of the time. You will find on YouTube there are some really nice videos around this safety 2 or safety differently concept. They're around half-an-hour videos, and they're produced actually by Sidney Decker and his colleagues. And I remember I was recently watching one video whereby one of the persons that they interviewed, I think this was in Australia at a oil and gas mining company, probably a mining company, yes. So the person they were interviewing, he gave the example of having like, let's say, miners or workers coming with a lot of experience into their companies, and the company basically telling them, disregarding their previous experience of doing things right? Like, let's assume that these people have not been involved in all these years in an accident or an incident, right? And then telling them, to start basically from point zero, basically, telling them, okay, these are the basic safety rules that you need to abide by. And most companies, they have some different rules or they have a different context. But what this does is, this does not take into account all the previous experience of doing things right that worker brings. So the video, there were a number of times they mentioned the word trust, which I think is important over here. This is what the safety 2.0 system or safety differently system focuses on. Like, they trust workers and their experience, and they trust them to behave in a safe manner or to carry out their task in a safe manner. Whereby the safety 1 system is, we're not trusting the workers over here, right? That's why we've got in place all these rules and regulations and that checklist that you need to abide by, no matter what your experience is, no matter what background you come from. In a safety one system, there's a reduced potential for innovation and performance improvement. And opposite to that, in a safety two system, there is an increased potential for innovation and thinking differently or critically. So what I mean by this is that if the focus is on the work, on the task, and carrying it out as safely as possible, this gives the opportunity for the worker, for the person carrying out the task to think critically and think on ways of improving it, rather than being boxed in by having standards or regulations set, whereby they can't do this or they can't step out of this boundary. So potentially this could, if we talk about innovation or thinking critically, this could result in a worker coming up with a more efficient or way of carrying out a task, or carrying out a task in a shorter period of time. Maybe that line that we were seeing earlier over here, that can be shortened even further. The worker's work can be done in a more easier way, in a more efficient manner. So I guess you guys might be thinking, okay, how we understand somewhat the concept of safety differently, or safety 2.0, but how do we implement this in our day-to-day lives, in our workplace? What are some potential tools? So again, during my research, I've come across a couple over here that I'm listing. And of course, they may differ from industry or company to company, and I'll be happy to hear if you have any ideas about some potential tools that can be used. After action reviews are one example. So basically reviewing a task after it's carried out, like I said, focusing on the task itself and what went right rather than what could potentially go wrong. Having appreciative walkarounds. Many, especially in the oil and gas industry, many companies and many sites, that we have management walkarounds, for example, occurring quite frequently, whereby the management or whoever it is, the HSE persons, they'll try and find what's wrong, but look at it from a different point of view and have a walk around whereby you appreciate what's going right, or what's safe behaviors, for example. It's a simple concept. Something else, an interesting point I came across, were day in the life programs, whereby basically the idea is that management or people who are not directly involved in day-to-day tasks, or even HSE persons, they could have a day, they could spend basically what we call a day in the life of the worker, of the person carrying out the task, at the person at the coal face, the person exposed most to risk, and see that, okay, how that gives you greater insight over how the task or any work can be carried out more safely, right? So it's a more innovative way of thinking about the task, thinking about the work and the workplace, and so on. I think it's important over here to point out, and both Sidney Decker and Eric Hognagel, the people who have been researching on this concept, that they make this point too, that safety 2 is not a silver bullet, right? So they're not, and I'm not advocating for this concept of safety 2.0 to, remove what the traditional safety systems that we have in place, but rather to work in a combined manner and see how, you can improve safety services, and how we can improve the safety statistics or performance at any site. So we're not saying that, you get rid of your PPE and all those other checklists and regulations and standards. We do obviously need those. We need to have that context of, what's right, what's wrong, what's allowed, what's not. And but at the same time, what they're saying is that focus on what goes right, and focus on how you can reduce the documentation, you can declutter the safety field itself, and focus on how people get things right. I'm going to leave you in the end with this question, which I think is an interesting and important question, and it sort of sums up what the safety 2.0 or safety differently topic is about. How will your organization work safely if tomorrow there were no regulations and industry standards to comply with? So if you were to strip away all of those regulations, standards, requirements, and if you were to focus only on the task, the job that you do or your company does, what would you bring in to make the task safer? Thank you all for your time.